Hello and welcome to Access All Areas of SEND, the podcast. Today I'm joined by Tony Sammon and we're going to talk about things to do with trauma informed and attachment and how those two things can link together. Tony is a teacher and a behaviour specialist with over 37 years of experience of working in schools. During that time, he's been a teacher, a SENCO, a deputy head in a large secondary school, and the head of a pupil referral unit. So he's seen behaviour just from about every angle. More recently, he's worked as a trainer and coach, supporting schools across the UK to move away from rigid, punitive systems and towards approaches that are more relational and more human and ultimately more effective. His work is grounded in real classroom experience rather than theory alone and draws on trauma-informed practice alongside some of the most respected voices in behaviour and education. Tony is also an author of Don't Lose Your Mind, a book that brings together stories, psychology, and practical strategies for anyone working with young people. He's known for his honest, down to earth style and his focus on what actually works day by day. So, thank you for joining me. You and I have known each other for a long time.
Absolutely.
Also, we're both Northerners, so my accent will come back in an instant. So really hard topic sometimes to talk about, and sometimes, and as you know, I ask my would-be listeners for questions, and one of the things that's come up through that is, trauma informed. Is it a buzzword? Everybody's using it. What are the fundamentals of trauma informed? But also, when you and I had a conversation around this episode, and I pulled a funny face when you talked about attachment and the fact that they can be linked and the nuances around that. I think this is a really important episode to be recorded, because parents, do come to me and say, I'm struggling. My kid is struggling in school. That he's had some trauma from going into school, so a place of relatively safety. But the first thing out of a practitioner's mouth is around attachment. And for a parent who's caring enough to spend the time of getting their child into school, that's a bit of a hard hit, isn't it? So let's talk about trauma informed. Let's talk about attachment and those links. So the question, I suppose, really is the first question is trauma informed a buzzword, and is it losing its impact?
That's a brilliant question, isn't it?
Thank you.
I do think there's a danger of it becoming a buzzword because, like all things in education, I taught in the classroom for 33 years, and if you stand still long enough, everything comes round and round in circles, doesn't it? And I think there's a lot of people saying, I want to be trauma informed without really understanding what that word means. And they think that I don't know, a 3 hour training session on trauma informed practice suddenly makes them a trauma informed school. And it really doesn't. And I think there's a real difference between just general understanding and really embedding practice. And I don't know about you, Tina, I think it comes down to the definition of what we understand by trauma, because a lot of people see trauma as the thing that happened, whether it's an adverse childhood experience or something really big that might have happened during childhood or adolescence or even adulthood. But it's not necessarily that. And that's why I think it's linked to the attachment system, because it's how we experience that thing. So two children could have exactly the same experience, and one child can experience that as trauma and the other one doesn't, because they've got someone there, they've got a consistent adult in their life that can help them make sense of that thing. And that's where I think the confusion lies. And I think the other thing that other people, there are commentators, aren't there, online on social media who say that trauma informed practice is just like brain gym. It's just another excuse to let kids get away with stuff. And it absolutely isn't. It's the opposite of that. Trauma informed practice and really good relational practice of any sort has boundaries, it has rules, it has consequences, it has all those things in place, but it's how we apply those things. And I think that's where the confusion happens when people think, oh, something's happened, therefore that's trauma. And it's not necessarily that. For me, I think that's the really key thing. It's that link between our attachment system. I I have an insecure attachment because no one's helped me make sense of this thing that's happened to me. And a lot of the research around trauma-informed practice focuses on early childhood, but I think things can happen later in life as well. Things can happen in later childhood, in adolescence. And sometimes, really sadly, some of our school systems can be traumatic in that sense, because they can give us a sense of self which is really wonky, that I don't fit into that. I'm a square peg in a round hole.
I think that's a really important sort of feature, I think, of trauma informed and the ACEs. And I'm glad you mentioned ACEs, because you and I have had conversations around that, and the fact that I had ACEs, and that's adverse childhood experiences as a child. And there's lots of training in lots of local authority areas, of one of which I've been part of in my local area. And this communication that to parents in particular, when they do these ACEs courses, to be more informed about the things and the choices that they're making to their children, is quite an interesting concept in the first place, because often those adults that are now parents have also had adverse childhood experiences, never had the conversations, never had the help and support, didn't have that special person as you're describing, and so sometimes the trauma then goes around at the next generation. And one of the things that really annoys me about those training sessions, I think they are important to have, because I think we need to talk about trauma and I think we need to talk about attachment. But the conversation, or the narrative, that if it's happened to you as a child, that actually your own children are more susceptible to ACEs. And actually, I don't agree with that at all. My circumstance, it ended with me, and I made a very pertinent choice about that. It was one thing that I wanted to do as an adult, was that I didn't want to bring anything with me to affect my children. And not everybody has that luxury. And certainly they don't have that luxury of having that supportive person that I did. And I've been very lucky, I've had quite a few people that have been like that for me. So I think, again, it's something that I'm mindful of as somebody who supports other parents, that it tends to be a big, heavy book that people smack over the head as like a punitive issue, when their child is kicking off at school, or they're just not settling, or it's behaviour or whatever, and they're not engaging. The first book that comes out is trauma informed or attachment, and that for me is interesting, but can be quite, I want to say, dangerous. I don't think it's danger in the true sense of the word, but it's not a great conversation to help and support a family that are struggling with this child, that actually not only are you deemed as a bad parent, and they might not say that word, but certainly the parent feels it. They're a bad parent. To add on to that, they're having trauma wherever, whether it's adverse childhood experiences or whether it's circumstantials that are not happening now. And then you add in, well, you're not even attached to your child.
Yes. Yeah.
It's quite it's a horrible conversation to receive, as well as give, I'm sure, but some people just don't seem to be that worried about giving that conversation.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
how do we talk about these subjects properly? And you've touched on it very briefly there, but how do we bring up that conversation and talk about it in a proper, therapeutic, helpful way?
There's so much there that you've just talked about. There's parental stigma, isn't there? And like when I was a kid, I had a lot of adverse childhood experiences. My dad died when I was very young. We lived in a lot of poverty. There was so much going on. But at the same time, in my childhood, there were a lot of protective factors as well. I came from a mining town where everybody in the street was a coal miner. So there was a real sense of community. I was part of a huge Irish Catholic community as well. We went to church every Sunday. My mum went to mass 3 times a week. So there was all of that stuff as well. So I think sometimes people confuse ACEs as almost like a numbers game. And I love Susan Zeedyk. She's a Scottish researcher, and she talks about this idea that ACEs are attachment ruptures and they increase risk, but that doesn't mean that that's going to happen. And like you, I'm hoping that that intergenerational transfer of trauma stopped with me, but it does increase risk. And I think where people sometimes go wrong, particularly when talking to families and talking to parents, is they do it in a very professional but a very cold way, and they count ACEs and they say this number of ACEs increases risk by this amount. And the real world doesn't work like that, because ACEs and protective factors are probabilities, they're not certainties. So just because a young person might have a high number of ACEs in their childhood, or a parent might have a high number of ACEs in their childhood, doesn't mean that that's going to repeat itself. Because I don't know about you, I think it's that balance between protective factors and childhood experiences that's really, really important. And we know that one of the biggest protective factors is a solid relationship with someone, whether that's a parent or an aunt or an uncle or a teacher. And I think for me, that's the really crucial thing, that it isn't about beating parents up with a big stick and saying, this has happened, therefore you're increasing this risk. And I don't know if you've seen it, there's a film that's put out by the Welsh government around ACEs, and it's this lovely little cartoon, and it talks about intergenerational transfer of trauma, but I hate it because what it does is it makes parents feel incredibly guilty about what they're doing. And I think there are things that cause ACEs, aren't there? There are things like poverty. We're one of the richest countries in the world, and yet the number of families that are accessing food banks in this country is sinful. There are social differences in the world today than there were 20 years ago. The growth of social media, my daughter had a baby recently, and you know that you can now get an attachment for a tablet in a cot. So all of that stuff is going to have an impact on a child, on their ability to cope, on their ability to navigate this really complex world that we all live in. So I agree with you, Tina. I think that it isn't about, parent blaming. It's about curiosity. And I think it's trying to instill that curiosity in every adult that we work with, whether it's a parent or a teacher or a social worker. It's about, okay, not necessarily what's wrong with you, but what might have happened to you. And let's do that without judgment. Let's do that in a way that feels safe, because psychological safety is everything. And if you're working with a parent who already feels stigmatized and already feels blamed, the last thing they want to do is go through an ACE questionnaire or sit with a professional or a practitioner who says, you do realize that this is a risk factor, don't you? Because that can just stop that relationship in its tracks from the start. So yeah, I think I agree. I think it's a complex process, but I think it's about just gauging the difference between a statistical probability, because we know, don't we, that ACEs and protective factors are this dance, really, this balance between them. But we do know that ACEs are a risk, they can increase risk, but it's not a certainty. For me, that's the key thing.
No, I agree. And, you've touched on it very briefly in what you articulated really well, is that, when you look at adverse childhood experiences, a lot of them can happen to anybody at any time. So you could end up in poverty because you've lost your job. You could end up homeless because you've lost your job and then you can't pay your mortgage. You could have a sudden death of a parent or a caregiver, which hasn't been, it's not explained, and it's nothing that you were aware of. It's not like they were ill and then they become, they die as a result of an illness. So I think, it is tricky, and I think we need to be mindful of the fact that these things happen and can happen to anybody. It's not just somebody who has a history of living in poverty, but also, has a sort of outside sort of influences either.
Mm.
So it just really can happen to anybody. And I think, as you say, to count how many adverse experiences you have or had have, no one needs to know a number really. It's
Yeah,
just for that child, it's a set of unfortunate incidences that often the child themselves aren't party to. They're not part of the decision process, or they're not party. It's not their decision to have this happen to them. So therefore, why are we deeming them as bad parents because of these set of circumstances? And I think that for me is the what that makes grinds my gears as somebody who would have been and has been a child. If they did ACEs back in the day, I definitely would have been on there with a. I think it was when I counted them from recent sort of training. I think I had 6 adverse, and that's a lot actually in that scheme of things. And yet I don't think I've turned out too badly myself.
yeah,
Do you know what I mean? That for me
absolutely.
is for me the because you said about the risks. People talk about the risks, and oh, well, if you've got this amount of adverse childhood experiences, you're more at risk of being in prison. You are more at risk of doing this. And yet I am a true, lived experience child as an adult now, and I've not done any of that as a consequence to my childhood experiences that I really didn't have any decision in. That's for me is so important, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think it's a helpful lens to see things
Yeah.
through, but it's not the only lens to see things through,
No.
And I think if we're truly curious about what's happening for a family, what's happening for a young person, we can look through that lens. And sometimes it can help us understand why that child is really wary of adults or why that child is really struggling at school. But it might not be the only reason. There might be other neurodiversities in there as well. There might be other family factors in there. It might be the school itself. And I am, I don't know, perhaps I'm going to get on my soapbox a little bit, but I
Please do.
worry about what we're doing with our school system at the moment.
Yeah.
And I worry that we are creating so many, square pegs for round holes to fit into, or the other way round. But it's not okay, when a child comes into school and they haven't got the right colour socks on, and so they get sent into an isolation room for a day. That is not good practice in anybody's book, whether you've experienced trauma or whether you've got some sort of neurodiversity or whether you're not. That's just not good teaching. It's not good teaching and learning. It's not good behavioural practice. And I think what we've got is this drive and strive to more punitive approaches in schools. And we've moved away from a more relational approach. I started teaching in 1989 in Poplar and East London, and you had to be good at building relationships with kids because you didn't survive otherwise, because you had to get them to trust you. And I think what we've now got is lots and lots of systems, and those systems are put in place to ensure that teachers can teach and the majority of young people can learn. But I think what we've also done is we've de-skilled a whole generation of teachers that think if I push this button, someone's going to come along with a walkie-talkie and take this child away from me. And I worry about that because I think that, if you're a child who struggles, or if you're a parent who struggles and you've got a history of that, what you're faced with is a school system that doesn't seem to want to hear or doesn't seem to want to listen. And that is not about school blaming, because I work with lots of schools who do the opposite of that. And they're absolutely amazing at building relationships with children, young people, with families. And, let's face it, schools are on the knees, aren't they? They're
Yeah.
absolutely shattered, they're
Yeah.
exhausted, they're dealing with more and more and more with less and less and less. So, pay rises aren't funded, budgets are depleting year on year. So schools are being asked to do more with less, and that isn't okay either.
No.
But I do worry about the general direction that we've taken, particularly with behaviour management in the last, say, 15 to 20 years. It seems to be more and more punitive and less space for understanding.
Yeah.
Pastoral time has disappeared. It's been replaced with extra maths. Break time in our secondary schools has been reduced. Lunch times are the average of about, what, 30, 40 minutes. So all of that has an impact on the developing child, the developing young person, doesn't it?
It does, and also the staff that are in those schools. And if you're, some people are going to listen to this and go, Tina, what you're on about? This is a podcast about supporting. The podcast is for everybody, but if you've got a member of staff, by the time that they've packed up their classroom, gone to the staff room, got their sandwich out their lunchbox, and sat down and started to eat that sandwich, and the lunch break is 30 minutes, 40 minutes tops, then get themselves ready for that lesson, they effectively have got a 10-minute break to eat that sandwich and gulp down their coffee.
Yeah.
And you can only deliver exceptional teaching from a full cup. 3/4 if you're being generous, if time's ticking. You cannot do that on a day-to-day basis and deal with the children in front of you. If you've got some very complex needs children, differentiating in the classroom is really difficult to do. It's really hard to manage. And then you've got parents who are struggling as well. They deem the school as the one that's going to help them and support them. It may be helping supporting to get a diagnosis for their child, because lots of neurodevelopmental pathway referrals come from schools now. It never used to, but they do. And I understand why, because they're at school most of the time and they see those behaviours. So I get that. You know, families are literally on their knees going, I need help and support. But if the school's cup is literally on the dregs because of the what they're having to deal with on a day-to-day basis, depleting numbers, no TA support, there's no one there to support the teachers. It's a huge system, isn't it, that's going to implode at any moment in time. And
And
so,
there is space, isn't there, to
yeah,
change that?
for sure.
I think that what we do is we all talk all the time about how terrible things are. And that things are really difficult. I've been at this now for nearly 37 years and I've never known it this challenging. But at the same time, if we keep saying how terrible it is, it's going to feel more terrible because our negativity bias will kick in and we can't see the wood for the trees. And I think there are so many things that impacted on that. The austerity years, early start centres, sure start centres disappeared almost overnight. Youth services were depleted overnight. School budgets were reduced in real terms since about the 1990s. And all of that has had an impact on the amount of support that we can give as a community. And I also worry, Tina, that what we're doing is we're almost creating polarities between parents and schools. And that's not healthy either, because everybody's trying to do this for the right reasons, for those children at the center of it. And we've then got, because of everything that's happening, we've got parents against teachers, we've got teachers against parents, and the people in the middle of that are our young people, aren't they? They're the ones that are bearing the brunt of that. I think it's about partnership, and I think we've forgotten how to do partnership because there's a lack of trust in the system, but that lack of trust is caused by all the other factors, the lack of money, the changes to accountability measures in schools. And don't get me started on Ofsted, because all of those things have an impact, not only on the school, but also on the young people too.
Yeah. I absolutely hear you about relationships. I think the success of me not copying my generation of childhood experiences has been those key people, and there's more than one. It's not just one person that have sort of helped me along the way, because underneath, that trauma that somebody could see and focus on, they didn't. They focused on me as a human being, going, actually, she's not too bad, she's quite a nice person. They helped and supported me to develop those skills even more. And I think you're right. I think if people had the time, that they could build those relationships with the children in front of them and the families that they support. That is what fundamentally helps and supports those families, isn't it? Is that relationship, somebody that they can trust. And in order to trust somebody, you have to develop a relationship with.
Yeah.
It's not that clear, is it? You can't trust somebody from the off. Okay, so when I said I was going to do this episode, I went out and asked questions from our would-be audience. And they did come back with a few. And I said, well, what do you want to know about trauma informed? And one of the things that's come back is I'd like for the approach to be clarified for those who assume it means being soft or not having high expectations. Ensure people understand that it's all about children being treated in a way that helps them feel safe and secure, which we've touched on, in their feelings and in everyday situations, which includes consistent logical boundaries and expectations, which you and I have talked about as well, because there is this thing where people feel sympathy.
Mm.
Well, they're doing that because of this. And it's almost like an excuse, which I don't agree with as somebody who's had adverse childhood experiences. But you can be empathetic. So acknowledge it, but actually go, well, I get why you're doing that, but actually you need to do this. And then there's that correctional sort of facility, if you like. um and so, as well as pace, etc. So what is pace? Because I didn't know what pace was, what it stands for. And it's an approach that works for all, not just for those with significantly traumatic backgrounds. So I think this is the thing, isn't it? Is that there could be an experience that isn't necessarily traumatic or adverse, but they've had an experience that then has put their guard up, so it's not allowed them to go into school wholeheartedly. So let's unpick that a bit and what pace is, I guess,
Okay.
for people who are
There's,
listening.
there's a huge amount there, isn't there? So,
There is. It's a
pa
great question.
yeah, it is. PACE was originally developed by a guy called Dan Hughes, who's an American psychotherapist, and he was working with parents who had adopted children who'd had adverse experiences, traumas, attachment difficulties, and they were really struggling to build relationships with their adopted children. And as a psychotherapist, he thought, I've got to try and find a way of helping them. So he developed this acronym of PACE, and it stands for playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, and empathy. And I've had the real privilege of listening to Dan Hughes speak on a number of occasions. And what he always says is that he wished he'd come up with a different acronym, because people really confuse it and they think that I always need to be playful. And I think this is where the misinterpretation happens, because being playful can break attention. You know, if a young person is being really distressed and really dysregulated, sometimes when we're playful in that moment, it can absolutely break attention. But there are other times when it's a real misattunement and it doesn't work. And particularly with teenagers, because they think you're belittling them and you're not taking what they're saying seriously. I think what Dan Hughes always talks about is acceptance comes first. And that isn't about accepting the behavior at all. It's about accepting that the young person is seeing things through a different lens. So they're seeing the world through a different filter than we are. And sometimes tiny, tiny things are experienced as big, big things, because I've got this sense of self which is really wonky. I don't trust other people as easily. My negativity bias is massive. If you look at the brain science underneath this, then their amygdala is operating like a smoke detector in the kitchen that goes off when the kettle goes on. So all of this stuff is happening. And so they're seeing the world through a different filter. And it doesn't mean that what they're doing is okay. Absolutely not, because then we still need, and you touched on this, we still need rules, we still need boundaries, we still need consequences. Those things are really crucial. I think the C of PACE comes through curiosity. It's checking out what's going on. You know, I can see you're really furious, mate. Can you help me understand what's going on for you here? And when we say things like that, rather than why did you do it? What did you do? Those standard sort of restorative type questions, young people get put on their guard when we ask those sort of questions. Whereas if we're a little bit gentler with our curiosity, and empathy is almost like the fuel that drives that. Empathy is different to sympathy. And I remember when I first came into teaching, I was a real rescuer, counter the state kid, coming in, wanting to change the world. And somebody tells you something that's really painful and really horrible, and you want to fix it, don't you? You want to rescue it. You want to take the pain away. And I think empathy is not that. Empathy is feeling into what the young person is experiencing. There's a phrase called mentalization, where we can imagine into our own thoughts and feelings, and we can imagine into the thoughts and feelings of someone else. And that's really the foundations of empathy. And if I haven't experienced that, if no one's ever done that for me, then I find that really hard. And sometimes I find it really hard to imagine into those thoughts and imagine into those feelings. Empathy is not about fixing, it's not about rescuing, it's about being moved and at the same time providing boundaries. So I think pace can be a really helpful approach, but it isn't always needed. I was in a secondary school, wonderful secondary school in Birmingham. I'm going to give them a shout out. They're called Summerhill School, and absolutely fabulous. They've been working for years on a more relational approach to behaviour management. They realise that you can have two things. You can have consequences, and at the same time you can be relational. And if kids are late to lesson, they get a warning. If they do it again, they get a detention. If they're stepping out of line in a lesson, then there's a consequence to what's happening. But it's done in a relational way. And I remember having a conversation with one of the teachers who said, well, we speak to the kids like they're human beings first before we discipline them. And I love that. It's this idea that, yeah, we can have a really strong framework of boundaries and discipline and consequences, but it's how you put those things into place. And not everything needs to be about pace. Not everything is a deep search into a child's, nervous system. I watched there was a kid who threw a flapjack at a girl's back when we were on duty, and I was on duty with the deputy head. And this kid threw this flapjack and hit the girl in the back. And the deputy head just turned around, gave the kid the look, the sorted out. The kid went, oh yeah, sorry, sir, went and picked it up, apologised to the girl, chucked it in the bin. There was no long searching exploration of reasons and depths into that. It was just, you've done something daft, stop doing it. And I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding around that with people that think everything has to be a restorative conversation, everything has to be around pace. It really doesn't, because think about being a parent, being a parent. There was a statistic that came out from Ed Tronick at Harvard, wasn't there, that you just need to get it right about a third of the time, thank God, eh? And you get it right about a third of the time, you get it wrong about a third of the time, and the other third of the time you just repair. You say sorry, you make amends, you reconnect with your child. And I think teaching's a bit like that, that we make mistakes as adults, we get it wrong. And when we model that to young people about, yeah, I'm sorry that I went over the top, didn't I? Can we talk about what happened yesterday? But what you did wasn't okay. We don't do that here, So I'm going to need to see you in detention, but we're going to talk about it then. And I think that's the misunderstanding around trauma-informed approaches. It's not about being soft. It's about being firm, but at the same time, it's about being relational. Two things can exist at the same time. We can be absolutely firm on the behaviour and at the same time gentle on the child.
No, I agree. And I too have worked in schools where I remember being on playground duty, and we had somebody who just started, and the head teacher said to to not model me, but to watch me, because I'm exactly the same. Whereas I've developed these relationships, and a child could be misbehaving, and I'd throw them the look, and they'd be like, and I remember the person who was watching me said, "Oh my God, you didn't even speak to them. You didn't need to. You just threw them this look." And I said, "I've earned that right for that look." It's again, it's developing that relationship. Somebody once said to me, "You go in hard and come out soft," and I don't think that that's a true reflection on building that relationship with the kids, because that's exactly what it is. And it's also modeling that adult behavior. You've got children who aren't adults. Some of them have had adult experiences as a child, which is really sad, but there are some children who haven't either. And so they're looking to you, aren't they, to see how you're modeling it. And, everybody does make mistakes. There is no person in this world that has never made a mistake ever. And it is about acknowledging the things that happen, acknowledging, having a conversation of going, so I get why you did that, but you need to do this, because in real life this is what could happen. And it's having those types of conversations, isn't it? And it isn't around being soft. My life and my experiences with people who have been really, really fantastic towards me, they equally haven't been soft. They've acknowledged that these things have happened. Sometimes they don't want to talk about it, and that's fine by me because it's not something I have openly shared until very recently. Um, but it is about, what is expected of you in society. So it's fine that you're mucking around now, but actually, if you did that as an adult, what could be the consequences to that? And that is what you have a conversation with. And I equally, I've got two children. Whenever they've had difficulties, you always acknowledge what they're feeling or what they think they're feeling. And sometimes you do have to have conversations around, so what you're thinking feeling is actually not quite, you are actually feeling this, especially when you've got neurodivergent children, as I have. Um, so it is that acknowledgement, and it's not making them feel silly or
Yeah.
insignificant, isn't it? It's so important.
It's validating how they feel, isn't it?
Yes,
And I
yes,
love that phrase, connect before correct, that you connect first. You say, yeah, I can see you're furious, aren't you? I get it, you must be livid, but that's not okay.
yeah,
We can't behave like that. We've got a rule about that here. And
yeah.
so this is what's going to happen. And I think the vast majority of young people, and I've worked, as you know, with young people who are extremely challenging and have been at the edges of the system for a lot of the time. When we apply a really consistent approach with them over a period of time, they gradually realize that they feel safe within that. And boundaries provide safety. And I think one of the biggest things, one of the biggest errors, I think, is when people say that this is a lack of control and the adults aren't in charge. It's the opposite of that, a really strong, whether you want to call it trauma informed or relational or attachment aware, all of those things are around boundaries and adults who are in charge, it comes back to, who was it, Donald Winnicott, who said, what was it, the 1950s? He talked about good enough parenting, didn't he? That doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be good enough. And I think teaching's like that, it just has to be good enough. As you said, we're not perfect, we make mistakes. Some of the humdingers I've made over the years, but when you acknowledge that and you say to the families, yeah, I'm really sorry, I got that wrong, didn't I? And you reconnect and you repair. That's the really crucial bit, I think. And that's the bit that I sometimes think, when we've got this polarity of view that we're the education staff and we're the parents and never the twain shall meet, I think that's where you've got a disconnect. That's where you've got a problem. It's all about relationships and connection and repair.
For sure. I have people come to me, asking me to support them in getting services or getting advice and support. And it is all relationship. If you want to trust somebody, you have to develop a relationship first. You can't just go in and expect that trust envelope to be yours. And I don't think parents have that expectation in the most. I think there are a few families that just expect them, schools to get it and understand their family dynamic and sort it out for them, and that doesn't often happen that way. But equally, I do think in order for a young person to work on themselves and develop themselves, they do have to feel like they belong. And in
Mm,
order to belong, you have to have that trust element and that relationship to belong, don't you, really?
absolutely. And Ofsted, it's the new buzzword for Ofsted, isn't it? Belonging. And now
Yes,
all of a sudden everybody's talking about belonging. And belonging has always been important. Do I matter to someone else? From the moment I walk into that school, do I matter, or is someone going to check what colour socks I've got on? And I think that you can't measure belonging, in my view. There are people out there now trying to develop belonging measurements and putting numbers on it. It's not something you can measure, it's something you feel, and when you walk into a school where belonging and mattering are the thing, you feel it from the moment you walk in. You feel it from the moment you speak to the receptionist, from the moment you speak to the cleaning staff. It's that sense of togetherness and it's that sense of community. And there are amazing schools out there that do this and they get this right, and they've got to be celebrated. But they're not the ones that are in the headlines. They're not Britain's strictest head teacher, are they? They don't tick all those boxes, but they quietly in the background are changing lives and making a big difference. And I think the other thing is, thinking from a parental perspective, because it's hard being a parent, and it's hard being a parent today,
Yeah,
when there's so much happening. And when we polarize parents, and when we blame parents, when we talk about it, and it comes back to the ACEs thing, doesn't it? When I come up with a list of things that have gone wrong and say, oh, this shouldn't have gone wrong, should it? Well, yeah, it has gone wrong, and that's what life's like sometimes. What are we going to do about it together? How can we manage this together? And I don't know about you, I think that we've now reached this point where Um, there's a big national debate about this around diagnosis in particular, and it's a really complex area. And a diagnosis can be absolutely life-changing. It can help me understand myself. It can help me come to terms with who I am. But on its own, it's not the answer. There needs to be relational practice to back that up. And I think sometimes we miss something when we put a label on something, when we diagnose something, which I said can be life affirming and it's really, really important. But at the same time, it's not the only thing that needs to happen
yeah, no, I
because
agree. Go on.
sometimes schools think, well, that's it. I've got the diagnosis. I've got the label. Therefore, that's why this is happening. And they sometimes stop being curious when that happens too.
Yeah, no, I agree. And, your thoughts around Ofsted, that came up with a previous episode of the pod where we talked about family inclusion. I had Brenda McHugh on it, and she was one of the co-founders of Family School in London, or the Pears School as it's affectionately known as. And, she talks about how, schools can be measured on progress 8 and attainment, and the sort of data that you have to produce as a school. And what her school do, they do collect some of the data that Ofsted ask for, but they're not great at it because it's an AP. And also that they delve into relationships. So families, it's parental inclusion, around parents being involved in the child as well, in the schooling, and then it's development from both sides. And I think that's a really important conversation, isn't it, to be had?
Absolutely. I was in a wonderful nursery in Bristol called Knoll West. I don't know if you know it, but some of the amazing work with parents. And I spoke to some of the parents who one of the parents I was speaking to said, "Oh, my kid left here years ago, but I still come back." So
Yeah,
there was a real sense of community and a real
yeah,
sense of togetherness, and there wasn't that either or. It was together. Parents trusted staff, staff trusted parents, and there was a real sense of we're in this together. The parents had transformed an old dining room space into an amazing, really psychologically safe environment. They spent their own money. They'd come in at the weekend. They'd done all this amazing stuff, and they are now a hub and a spoke. So they're building this relational practice across Knoll West with the primaries, with the secondaries, and trying to spread that message across. And I think that's where it's at. It's not about big political messages. It's about practice into policy. It's about tweaking what we do day in, day out, making sure that it's done really, really consistently by everybody. And also recognizing, like this time of year, this is the last week of term. We're 2 days away from the end of term in most of our schools. Everybody's on their knees, both kids
yeah,
and staff, and it's recognizing that too. It's recognizing that we need to perhaps step off the gas a little bit in these few days, not have staff meetings, not have this, that, and the other, not have all these progress checks. Let's think about how we can keep everybody psychologically safe.
yeah. Because if you're, I use the analogy to parents around the aircraft. So you put your when the aircraft is in trouble, the first bit of advice when the masks come down is that you put it on yourself first and then put it on the person you're with. Because if you're not able to function, then you can't help the person that you're with. So whether that's a child or husband, partner, whatever. And I think that's a true, and I need to follow it myself more, I have to say.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's a true analogy, isn't it? You have to drink from you in order for you to drink, you have to drink from a full cup. You can't do it from an empty cup.
Yeah.
One of the last questions I'm going to ask is around, do you think that the term trauma informed has unintentionally become a barrier to universal adoption in mainstream education? The word trauma allowing some to dismiss the approach as only relevant to a minority of pupils. And if so, how might we reframe it?
What a brilliant question.
I know it's almost like
Yeah.
you've typed them in. I know you
If I had, I'd
haven't.
know how to answer it. I think it comes back to when we were talking about the notion of things being a buzzword. I think it's related to that. I think it's also a misunderstanding of what trauma is. And when people talk about trauma informed, people then think that all behavior is because of trauma. It isn't. Some behavior is obviously a choice. It's some behavior is a conscious choice, some behavior is an unconscious choice based on our previous experience. And I think there is a danger of the word trauma informed putting some people off. I know some very, very prestigious, very excellent head teachers in schools who are put off by the word trauma because they see it as that's just for a small group of children, and they equate it as an intervention. And it isn't. It isn't an intervention. It isn't something that's done in a cupboard down the end of a corridor with a trained practitioner. This is a whole school awareness, I think, and a whole school approach. Uh, Whether you call it trauma, whether you call it relational, whether you call it attachment aware, I think it's what good teaching and learning has always been. It's about making everybody feel safe, psychologically and physically. It's thinking about rules, routines, but also adult behaviors. How do I, as an adult, make our young people feel really safe coming into this space? How do I make my staff feel really safe coming into this space? How do I make my parents and my visitors feel part of this community? It's all about safety, and that's where it starts. That's the foundation of everything. And I think that if we get that, if we can get that message out there that this isn't some airy fairy hippy dippy nonsense, it's actually rooted in psychology, in neuroscience, in understanding. John Bowlby talked about this in the 1950s, didn't he? When he was talking about attachment, he said that some children will either shrink from the world or they'll do battle with it. And I've always loved that phrase, that we notice the ones that are doing battle with the world, don't we? We spend all of our time focusing on those kids that are trying to climb the fence, or they're telling us to F off, or they're charging around the school field. We sometimes miss the kids that are shutting down, the ones that are really quiet, they're shrinking from the world. And I think what we've unintendedly done in our education system is we've focused so much on results and so much on progress, which is really important. Exam grades are really important. It's a passport onto another life. It's what got me out of my council estate when I was a kid. But at the same time, if that's all we focus on and we don't think about what's underneath that, we don't build communities. We don't think about psychological safety. We don't build relationships. We don't apologize to kids when we get it wrong. That's what trauma informed practice is. It's not rocket science. It's just good practice. And it's what good practice, I think, has always been. You know, I think it's a really good question. There is a danger, and there is a danger that people think it just refers to a minority of young people. It doesn't. I was I went into a very prestigious public school, did a bit of work for Paul Dix a couple of years ago, and he sent me into a school called Lord Wandsworth. It was where Johnny Wilkinson went, the England rugby player. And the parents were paying 40, 50,000 pounds a year to send their kids to this school. And I remember speaking to a group of sixth formers, and I spoke to these kids and I said, "So what's it like living here then?" And this one boy said, "Oh, my parents live a mile and a half down the road, but I'd rather live here because they don't really want me." And I thought, oh my God, there was a realization for me as an inverted snob, ex-council estate kid, going into this really prestigious school thinking that kid has experienced trauma. He's got attachment difficulties because his parents don't want him. And so he's living in this public school with all these people where he's got a sense of belonging. He's got a sense of connection. He's got all this prestige that goes with leaving that place and probably going on to Oxford and Cambridge and all the rest of it. But there's something missing in his life. And I think that's the bit that we don't focus on enough in education. We don't focus on the missing piece, which is that relational practice. So for me, I think, it doesn't really matter whether you call it trauma informed or whether you call it attachment aware or whether you call it just relational. I think it's just good teaching. It's just good learning. It's understanding young people. I don't know if that answers the question or not.
It answers the question, and actually, it's the perfect end to this episode. I mean, we could talk forever, couldn't we? Well, we do every time we speak. We're on. We schedule like half an hour, and we end up talking for 2 hours. But no, I think it's really a really good ending, and I think we do need to focus on relationships and what that brings, because that boy that you talked about from the prestige school could end up being our future prime minister, or somebody in charge of something. And you do need a stroke of empathy, I think, in order to deliver services. I personally think, and so it is important, as well as the exams, the results, and all of that. It is important, but relationships are what moves the world, I think. It's what changes the world as well. So perfect ending. Thank you, Tony, for bringing that to me. It's perfect. Thank you.
I really enjoyed it, Tina. Thank you.